Okay, I will turn the sound on. Uh, Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's uh, latest book presentation with Taras Kuzio on his book Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War. Taras Kuzio is professor in the Department of Political Science at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, as well as the author or editor of more than 20 books, as well as having published papers in nationalities papers, ethnic and racial studies, and of course, nations and nationalism. I should add, we do have a special issue, special collection. If you just Google nations and nationalism, and I know that Taras's one of Taras's papers is in there, and it's free to read. His most recent book, the one we're discussing today, is Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War. It's published now by Routledge, available as a physical book or as Kindle. The book starts with actually a really useful discussion of civic and ethnic conceptions of the nation before applying those to Russia and Ukraine. It then gives a detailed look at the history of how Russian nationalist conceptions of Ukraine have come about and changed and been changed through the USSR, Cold War under Yeltsin, and then under Putin. It then looks at how Russian nationalism has been used to justify Russia's policies towards Ukraine, and it ends sadly with a pessimistic view that the war between Russia and Ukraine is likely to continue because the justification for it, that Ukraine does not exist as a separate nation, has become embedded in Russian political discourse. This gives a very rich understanding of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine that, although we are very much aware of its current phase, dates far further back. So we are on Zoom, Facebook, and on YouTube. If you do have any questions, do please put them in the relevant chat box, and I will ask them of Taras. We're just going to have a short introduction at the beginning, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, do please put them into chat, and we'll go to those pretty quickly. So welcome, Taras. Thank you very much for joining this evening. Congratulations on the book. Let me start with a very general question. Who is Taras Kuzio? Tell us about yourself.
Oh, it's Charles Kuzio. I was born in God's own country, Yorkshire, of mixed parentage. Father is Ukrainian, mother Italian, which is actually quite more common than people imagine because of who came to Britain after the war. From Eastern Europe, it was mainly men who were military or slave, like my father, slave labor in Nazi Germany. Britain had a very rich community of Ukrainian sort of community centers, and I grew up in those. I developed a very strong interest very early on in the nationality problems in the Soviet Union. And ironically, when I was doing my master's degree at SEAS, School of Slavonic and East European Studies in London, in the 80s, my professors were telling me there is no nationality problem in the Soviet Union. It's been resolved. Well, I tried to prove them wrong. And with developments under Gorbachev, we know what happened. The USSR disintegrated, and Ukraine, of course, led that way. I became interested in this particular topic as well because it seems that life is a full circle. And I've kind of returned to something I was interested in back in the early 80s when I wrote and published my very first semi-academic article on Russian nationalism and Ukraine. And actually, I ironically used some of that material. It shows the test of time for this book. I think we have to just quickly clarify the problem we have in using the term Russian nationalism. It's used obviously a lot because you can't really use long-winded terms. But I stress in the book that Russians are different in that they have never sought to have an independent state. So if nationalism, the goal of nationalism is to create an independent state, then that's a problem in defining it as Russian nationalism. To some degree, this is similar to the English. I mean, there is no English equivalent of the Scottish National Party, for example. There's no English demand for secession from United Kingdom. But the difference is that England became a nation state before it became a union state and an empire. And that's never been the case in Russia. Russia became an empire before it became a nation state, and therefore, to this very day, Russians, they don't associate with their republic, whether it was in the Soviet Union or today. They tend to define Russia, in inverted commas, as far bigger: Russian world, Eurasia, Commonwealth of Independent States, former Soviet Union, and many other variations, but not the republic. And that, of course, creates problems for Russia's neighbors. As one particular author in Nations and Nationalism about 15 years ago said, maybe it's better just to call this Russian imperialism, or you could, as I do, call it Russian imperial nationalism. It's certainly not separatist nationalism, shall we say. Why did I find this book interesting to write? Because I could see that there was a gap. There was this nationalism in Russia was evolving, developing, and Western Russianists, i.e. scholars involved in Russian history or Russian political science, were ignoring it. And particularly they were ignoring the growing influence, which I stress a lot in the book, of white Russian emigres. And that, to me, is a key factor. And we've seen that today, because the big difference between the Soviet Union and white Russian emigres was that the Soviet Union did recognize a separate Ukrainian people, did recognize a Ukrainian language, and Ukraine was sovereign, in inverted commas, inside the Soviet Union. In fact, Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations in 1945, because Stalin managed to wangle 3 seats at the UN, USSR representing Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. So white Russian emigres are different in that they continued the Tsarist imperial view of a pan-Russian nation, Общий Русский народ, which is similar, I guess, to the pan-Germanic view that the German people, German nation or Russian nation is far bigger than simply just Russians in the Russian Federation. So there are little Russians who are Ukrainians, white Russians, Belarusians, and great Russians. And they're 3 branches of one people. And that the view that Ukrainians were always created by a Western conspiracy was born in the late 19th century in Tsarist Russia, and it's continued to this very day in Putin's Russia. Then it was the culprit was of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today the culprit is Washington and the CIA. I also found in trying to get this published, trying to get these ideas published, that I was being blocked by in academic journals. Anybody who's, and especially young people listening to this will I don't want to put them off, but it is a trial process to get published in academic journals, because one of the major problem areas that exists in many journals is external referees. Many academics don't even want the job. They find it too tedious to do it. It's a lot of work if you do it properly. But of course, Russianists in the West dominate over, say, Ukrainianists or Lithuanianists or Georgianists, and they tend to therefore act as gatekeepers, and they're often called upon as external reviewers. And so I was getting blocked writing about this in at least 4 or 5 different journals, including 1 or 2 British ones. You have to just keep persisting, and eventually you'll find a place to get published. But I think there's been a problem in 2014. There was a problem when it first began, this crisis, and there's a problem even more today, that Western Russianists can't get their heads around what's going on. Because they also kind of believe to some degree that Ukrainians and Russians were very close. They were from the same kind of orthodoxy. Western historians of Russia keep talking about 1,000 years of Russian history, like Putin. They talk about Kievan Russian, not Kievan Rus. And so that kind of confusion of Ukraine as just a kind of a branch of Russia is actually quite embedded in Western academia, particularly amongst historians. And so I think that they are really having a problem in 2014. Today, they must be having a total collapse in understanding what's going on, because they just can't figure out why. And if you put a panel of Russianists up above you, in front of you, and ask them, why is this invasion taking place? I very much doubt that any of them would be able to answer the question. So here is why it's happening.
Can I
Right.
jump in there just with a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Why do you think Western Russianists sort of, how did they come to that view of Ukraine being sort of an appendage to Russian nationalism?
Well, it's firstly, I mean, if you go to any library like University of London Library and pick up a history of Russia, that history of Russia always begins in Kiev. And so Western historians of Russia, who are probably of liberal persuasion, are actually using 19th century Russian nationalist frameworks for the history of Russia, because they're basically saying that there was, we were all born together, 3 Eastern Slavs in Kiev and Russia. Then they were artificially separated by foreign intrigue and invasions. They always wanted to get back together again. And then there was this continuation of a kind of a Russian state. So actually, most Western histories of Russia are very similar in viewpoint to what Putin is saying about the unity or the 1,000-year unity of Ukraine and Russia. Now, I guess the difference would be that Putin says we were born together and we should always live together. And then anybody opposing that is a traitor and should be dealt with. Whereas Western historians will say, look, if you want to go your own way, that's up to you. But that kind of conception that Ukraine is a kind of younger brother appendage of Russia is I think, relatively deep, especially historians, more than political scientists. And certainly it's very widespread that Crimea was always Russian for some reason. That's the viewpoint. So what was the big deal about what Russia did in 2014? I mean, Crimea was never Ukrainian, it was always Russian, which is also a strange thing, really, because Crimea only became Russian in the 1780s. So that assumes that Crimea had no history prior to the 1780s. It's actually quite racist, because Crimean Tatars had a state in the Crimea for 600 years prior to the Russian Empire. So you're basically denying the history of Ottoman and Crimean Tatar rule, and prior to that, Kiev Rus. Now, Western historians of Ukraine and historians in Ukraine have a totally different viewpoint. They basically use the Western territorial civic approach to history and say everything that happened within the boundaries of this nation state we call Ukraine is the history of Ukraine. And that means that Kiev Rus was actually the first Ukrainian state, not the first Eastern Slavic. The problem is, if you start talking about the Kiev Rus or Kievan Russia as this some kind of East Slavic conglomerate, then you're portraying the fact that these Eastern Slavs should always be together. They were born together, they should always be together. And you've got the elder brother in Moscow and the younger brother in Kiev. The irony, of course, being that Moscow was founded 600 years after Kiev. So who was the elder brother, who was the younger brother? But in 2016, for example, Vladimir Putin unveiled a monument to a Kievan Rus ruler next to the Kremlin. That ruler, Vladimir the Great, or in Ukrainian, Volodymyr the Great, ruled Kievan Rus when Moscow didn't exist. So we have territorial claims against Ukraine and also historical claims. I mean, all of these things are mixed together, and you can get a feeling of that by reading Putin's long-winded 6,000-word essay published in July of last year, which I think finally got people to understand that the approach I've taken is actually in the right direction. Because what happened was Putin was isolated for 2 years with COVID, and he probably read too many White Russian emigre books and wrote this long essay.
So I've got to ask about the importance of. I mean, there's loads there I want to ask about, and I do actually. I'm going to have to start by saying you're talking about the end of the Soviet Union, showing that actually the national question hadn't been settled. Um,
Mhm.
that was actually one of the things that also caused ASEN to be founded in
Yes.
1991, saying, "Oh, all of a sudden we need to be talking about nations and nationalism. They very much have not gone away." Um, the I just like to know more generally about the impact of immigrant writing and what effect that had, but also what was the sort of shape that was taking. So you have white Russian emigres, Ukrainian emigres, and so on. I was at a paper recently about Armenian diasporic media in the United States, in that it started serving an Armenian community is an Armenian language content with the view that one day we will go back. But that changed to become English language and for a settled community. And that changed how the homeland was presented. Do you
Mhm.
see it? Was there anything similar with that? I mean, we're talking over the sort of early part of the 20th century, I'm guessing. Do you, or is it
Yeah,
like
yeah. I mean, there was. I guess every emigre community is different. I mean, the Ukrainian one was very organized, and that was a product of really Austrian-Hungarian influence
right?
on Ukrainians. I mean, they really did create a vast community centers, civil society groups, youth groups, you name it. The Russian emigres were very disorganized, and very much squabbling. What they did have in common was that they believed that Russia should be reborn as an empire, not really as a nation state. And so Russian and Ukrainian emigres, or Russian and emigres from the other republics, shall we say, including Ukraine, could never actually get on in the diaspora. And
Mm.
even Alexander Solzhenitsyn became embittered with the Ukraine when he lived in the US. He became embittered with Ukraine nationalists. The difference was, I guess, was that um, in Western academia, Russian emigre intellectuals, particularly in the US, received quite high ranking positions. And they wrote histories of Russia, which became standard works for students in North America and elsewhere. And like historians like Florensky and Ryazanovsky, for example, they became standard works which promoted this kind of imperial view of, Kievan Russia going up to the present day, and Ukraine a kind of a sort of an appendix of Russia, or irrelevant appendix. That only began to change in the 1970s when Ukrainian diaspora groups raised money to establish chairs of Ukrainian studies at prestigious universities, University of Toronto, Harvard, then Columbia, and University of Alberta. And they began to produce alternative, shall we say, publications and works which challenged these traditional viewpoints. Also, one of the leading journals of nationality problems in the former communist world was born then, and that was Nationalities Papers. And that was created by Latvian and Ukrainian emigres, by their diaspora groups, because they also could see that the nationality problem in the Soviet Union was being ignored by people who were then called Sovietologists.
Mm.
And in fact, quite a few scholars in the early 90s wrote about, why did Western Sovietology miss the nationality problem and therefore miss the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I've written elsewhere that, in fact, there have been two crises like these of Russian studies, one in 1991, where they really did not see the end of the USSR coming, and one in 2014 with the Ukrainian-Russian war. So that inability to see the nationality problem was there. Now, I think something that would be of interest to everybody here is to try to, and it fits in with my kind of book, as it were, is that to understand the Soviet Union was very different to other multinational communist states like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. And the difference was is that, for example, in Belgrade, in Yugoslavia, there were Serbian and Yugoslav institutions. So Serbian Republican and Yugoslav Federal. So Serbia and Yugoslavia were separate entities. And the same in Prague, they were Czech and they were Czechoslovak Federal. In the Soviet Union, there were no Russian institutions in Moscow. There was just Soviet. So this was a deliberate policy undertaken whereby Soviet and Russian identity was merged. So, for example, in Kiev, you had a Soviet Ukrainian Communist Party, Soviet Ukrainian Communist Youth League, Academy of Sciences, etc. In Moscow, there was nothing of that. So then it's not surprising, therefore, that Russia did not declare independence in 1991. Ukraine did, Belarus did, Georgia did, Latvia did, etc. But Russia didn't, because how could Russia declare independence against itself? And so Russia celebrates every year its so-called Declaration of Independence based on the July 1990 Declaration of Sovereignty, right, not independence, because which Ukraine also did, but Ukraine also had a Declaration of Independence. Russia doesn't have a Declaration of Independence. It never declared that. So what happened in late 1991, early 1992, is that this new Russian state just basically took over Soviet institutions in Moscow. And that had massive ramifications for the development of the Russian state, because you basically took over the senior levels of the Ministry of Defense, KGB, and all these other institutions, making this a very top-down heavy Soviet kind of state. Whereas the other republics like Ukraine, Latvia, Georgia, they had to build new institutions for independent states from the bottom up. But the key thing here is that if you have an identity which is Soviet mixed with Russian, then of course you're not going to associate your identity with the Russian Federation in the 1990s. That was seen as a kind of an artificial construct, and your Russianism, is bigger. It's the Soviet Union, Commonwealth of Independent States, Eurasia, etc., Russian world. And so that Soviet legacy has a direct impact on today. And of course, especially when you have an ex-KGB officer like Vladimir Putin coming to power.
I mean, I've said the thing that jumped to mind again was the comparison to the UK and England. If you walk along Whitehall, where all the civil service offices are in London, there's a Welsh office, there's a Scotland office, there's a Northern Ireland office. There is no England office. And I know there's a fascinating connection there, but that's sort of going off. I do have a couple of questions coming through, and if you do have any questions, put them in the chat or in whichever form you're in. One from Rachel on the book, asking, is your argument that Ukraine is best understood as a civic nationalizing project and Russia as an ethnic nationalizing project?
I actually wrote an article in Nations and Nationalism, which
excellent journal.
Yes, which actually was very critically disposed towards Brubaker's theory of nationalizing states, and because it was, to me, it was very biased. It somehow only talked about nationalizing states among the non-Russian successor states of the USSR, but never about Russia. So I'm a bit wary of using this term nationalizing states, because it's also a bit of a non-Orientalist approach, because it's us Western Europeans pointing the finger, as we always do, to the east and saying, look at the nationalists over there. We're the good guys, but the nationalists over there. We're the we have patriotism, they have nationalism. So I'm a bit wary about using that term nationalism. I mean, there is no question that successor states like Ukraine, and I don't think it's just Ukraine, but Ukraine, say, they always adopted a civic approach, in that everybody who was living in Ukraine on the 1st of January 1992 automatically became a Ukrainian citizen. Now, that approach was applied everywhere in the former USSR except Latvia and Estonia, which applied Germanic ethnic criteria for citizenship. In Ukraine, that civic approach has always been there, but the first chapter as we've already mentioned, the first chapter of the book goes into that problem of understanding civic and ethnic. I mean, no country in the world is a pure civic state. They simply don't exist. If they existed, we wouldn't have nation states. And therefore, every state is a composite of civic and ethno-cultural factors. Now, in some states, there's more than one, like Belgium, shall we say, or Switzerland. In Ukraine, there's just the one. And so when we are talking about Ukraine as a civic state, yes, we are talking about Ukraine as a civic state, which has decided that Ukrainian ethno-cultural attributes are the defining elements of that state: Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture. Now, the Russian view of Ukraine is that it should resemble Belarus. And that is more a Soviet and pan-Russian identity view, that we are kind of branches of one people. And therefore, that has implications for all sorts of things: how you approach history, what things you celebrate, what monuments you put up. And also very important from the Moscow point of view, that there should be two state languages in the country, Belarusian Russian and Ukrainian Russian, not one. Because that Russian view of what Ukraine should look like Belarus means it should resemble an East Slavic state as opposed to a Ukrainian state. So actually, Russia is really proposing a kind of a Belgian variant on Ukraine, whereby you have two titular nations, Russians and Ukrainians, and two state languages. And it's de facto continuing the Soviet approach, this East Slavic kind of identity for Ukraine, that, you know, Ukraine was born with Russia, should always be with Russia. It's actually based on primordial nationalism, to be quite honest.
Actually, can I just pick up on that? I mean, I've got some other questions to come on to, but this isn't specifically in the book. Well, it's touched on, but how do you think Russian speakers in Ukraine see themselves? But also, how has the conflict since 2014 changed that? But also the current phase of the war changed that? Because there has been for a long time this view that you have a sort of bifurcation within Ukraine, that you have Ukrainian speakers who look towards the European Union, and Russian speakers who look towards Moscow and Russia. It's always more complicated than that. But how was that ever? Did that ever have any use? And has that changed at all over the period of the current conflict?
Well, it's an excellent question, and of course it has changed, but for many ways. I always believed that there was an exaggeration to focus on a country divided into linguistic groups, because the reality on the ground was that most people, particularly Russian speakers, were bilingual. And it really depended on, this idea that somehow the middle of the country, the river Dnipro, split the country was very, very exaggerated, because I mean, there's a major difference between, for example, Crimea and Donetsk on the one hand, and other regions closer to the river and with others. So yes, it was, in my view, it was highly exaggerated. But more importantly, it showed up, this was shown up to be the case in 2014, and in particular today. What I will say straight away up front is that in Moscow, they simply cannot get their heads around Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriotism. It's simply impossible for them to understand, because of their very ethnicized and primordial view of identity. They in Moscow, in the Kremlin, are absolutely convinced if you're a Russian speaker, you should be pro-Putin, you should be pro-Eurasia. There is no alternative. And so they simply can't explain what's going on in Ukraine, because they were always convinced that in 2014, the Euromaidan revolution, a small nationalist elite with CIA backing came to power in a putsch. They were ruling over the country, and the majority of the population are little Russian speakers and little Russians who are eagerly waiting liberation. And on this premise was why Putin invaded with such a small invading force. And it was, for the size of Ukraine, 150,000 is pitifully small. Ukraine has 500,000 security forces. Now, usually you have at least twice as many for an invading force. Because he expected these little Russians who were being subjugated, once the nationalist elite were kicked out and Zelensky ran away and everything, that these little Russians would greet them with flowers. In fact, they greeted them with javelins and stingers. Now, so yes, the Russian speakers already in 2014 showed that they were very patriotic, and we, two colleagues of mine and myself, published an edited volume on the region of Dnipropetrovsk, which is to the west of the Donbass, and also in January, a month before the invasion. All the 8 chapters were submitted to Problems of Post-Communism. They were rejected again. So we published as a book. It's available to be downloaded on e-IR free of charge. The book, for example, has a chapter on the Jewish community in Dnipropetrovsk. Dnipropetrovsk has had the biggest Jewish revival in Europe since 1991. And Jews primarily are Russian speakers, but they solidly supported Ukraine. Jews in Ukraine and elsewhere tend to be anti-Soviet because the Soviet Union suppressed their religion. And in Ukraine, that religion has been allowed and been fostered to develop. So that was an example of how Russian speakers throughout Eastern Ukraine, except probably for the Donbass and Crimea, supported a civic Ukrainian identity over a more ethno-cultural Russian world identity. Because I think this is very much, again, we should not fall into the trap of listening to Russian propaganda. This is a war between linguistic groups. This is a war between civilization identities. You either identify with civic Ukrainian or civic ethnic Ukrainian identity, or you identify with the former Soviet Union stroke Eurasia, and therefore you're pro-Russian. And that really is the choice there. So yes, as for 2022, well, this Putin has made the entire Ukrainian nation into a nation of nationalists. I mean, the hatred towards Russia after this invasion will last for decades. I'm not sure everybody's got their heads around this yet, but it will last for decades. And one of the reasons is that the most brutal aspects of this invasion, the destruction, the war crimes, and everything else has taken place in Russian-speaking areas of Eastern Ukraine. So the army that was supposed to be liberating Russian speakers from genocide is actually committing genocide against those Russian speakers. So Putin has completely changed the national identity dynamic of Ukraine, and I was just in Kiev a couple of weeks ago. Drove in from Krakow. That's the only place, the closest place you can fly into in Ukraine. And I interviewed in Kiev the leader of a former pro-Russian political party called the Opposition Platform. And I asked him, is pro-Russianism dead in Ukraine? And he said yes. So Putin has destroyed pro-Russianism in Ukraine, and Russian-speaking Ukrainians are doing as much as Ukrainian speakers in fighting the Russian invasion.
I have a question from Vitaly, and I'll put it to you, possibly slightly controversial, but I'll see what you think. Don't you think that the fact that the West has completely missed the development of Nazism in contemporary Russia is evidence of the crisis of Russian studies in the West? In my opinion, the West, in fact, does not have its own narrative of Russian history, but only repeats the Russian chauvinistic narrative imposed by Vernadsky, Karpovich, and other Russian immigrants who founded American Sovietology. Now, I know we've covered some of that a little bit earlier on, but do you think, in the same way that if sort of building on that, that Western Russianists missed what was going on in the past, is that still happening today, or have sort of current events provoked a reassessment of that?
Well, I didn't notice much change from 2014 to the invasion. To be honest, I think it was more I mean, people like me were having still problems getting published because Russianists who were acting as external reviewers were not really happy with what I was saying. I mean, I even had an article talking about the cult of Stalin in Putin's Russia turned down by national identities, which was incredible. I mean, there is a cult of Stalin, and it was published elsewhere. So I think that I didn't see much evidence of that. With what's happened with the invasion, it's a bit early to say because it's only been a few months. But I mean, this will have to have a complete revamp, I think, of Russian and Eurasian studies, or however you want to call it, post-communist studies. There will have to be a complete revamp of how we approach these. Russian-Ukrainian relations, for example, are completely changed now because of this. The whole concepts of the Western Russian is applied to Ukraine, of this, as you said, divided country between Russian and Ukrainian speakers is out of the window now. It's not the case anymore. I think there's going to be inevitably there will have to be some prodding, I think, from people like me. And I think a key role, by the way, is going to play journals which are not in the field of Russia and Eurasian studies. I think journals like Nations and Nationalism are able to deal with these very difficult, challenging new issues in an easier way than journals working in the field, where you have set authors and set academics, and they don't like change. Academics don't like change. So I think it's going to be something that journals do, especially journals involved in nationalism studies, are going to be able to do that. But yes, I published a book 3 years ago called Crisis in Russian Studies. That was before this invasion. I think it's even more pertinent today about how we need to revamp and relook at the whole area of post-Soviet, post-communist Russian Eurasian studies.
I mean, of course, there's always the problem as well that the lead time on getting an article out in a journal,
Yes.
whichever journal, is very long. And when you've got a fast-moving situation, by the time, I mean, this is certainly the case in military studies, you end up getting historical stuff published all the time, because if you write something contemporary, by the time it's published, it's out of date. Go back to the book I made. You identify in the book three key moments that shape where we've got to today. So the Orange Revolution,
yes,
then 2012, and then 2020. Let's start with the Orange Revolution. Just for people who perhaps don't have all the background, what happened with the Orange Revolution? Because we had all of the so-called colour revolutions going on at that time, but also why does that matter? And then perhaps we can go on through what happened in 2012, 2020, and up to today.
Well, I think it's a good and easy way to look at the evolution of how nationalism in Russia and Putin and his allies kept moving further and further to the right at each stage. I think what happened in 2003, 2004, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, Orange Revolution in Ukraine, was that what resurfaced was this Soviet and KGB conspiracy paranoia that these kinds of protests were orchestrated by Western powers, CIA, the European Union, etc. Because they could never understand that these could be authentic local protests. Again, this has Soviet roots, because the Soviet propaganda used to always talk about dissidents and nationalists as being linked to Western intelligence agencies. So they could never see them as authentic local people, as it were. That became a major turning point. Also, I think developments with Chechen terrorism in Russia, Putin began blaming this on having Western support, which wasn't true. In fact, the opposite, I would say. And so 2005 up until 2008, 2009, you had a whole host of different things taking place. You had the first attack on a NATO member, cyber attack against Estonia, 2007. You had the invasion of Georgia, 2008. You had something that's been largely ignored in Western writing, the unification of the two branches of the Russian Orthodox Church, the emigre and the one inside Russia. This turbocharged Russian nationalism towards a white Russian emigre path, because the emigre church was the anti-communist white emigre church. And so that brought that influence, added that influence. You also had the beginning of the republication of white Russian emigre authors in Russia, and Putin and others circulating this literature amongst school children, today's conscripts fighting in Ukraine, amongst government officials, and amongst soldiers. You also had the creation of what was called the Russian World Foundation. Now, this was allegedly modeled on, on the British Council and elsewhere, but it had nothing similar to the British Council. This was an organization, led by Russian intelligence services to spread Russian influence amongst Russian speakers. The second, so all this is happening. Putin becomes prime minister. They do the musical chairs. Medvedev becomes president. Putin's prime minister, to get over the problem of the constitution only allowing 2 terms as president. Putin, again, like with the COVID pandemic, he goes into a bit of isolation and starts reading too much again. And I think this increases the influence of the Russian world concepts, Russian Orthodox Church, white Russian emigres. He comes back as president in 2012 after mass protests in Moscow, which again he believes are orchestrated by the US, by the West. And he sees as evidence of that, Hillary Clinton, then US Secretary of State, supporting these protests against election fraud. That, by the way, led to him seeking revenge against Hillary Clinton in 2016 by supporting Donald Trump. Putin comes back and believing he's going to enter Russian history as the gatherer of Russian lands. By Russian lands here, this means the pan-Russian nation. That means the Eastern Slavs as a whole. So Crimea, Ukraine, Belarus. And that's the way he's going to enter. He's also coming back in a different era where Russia's not only opposed to NATO enlargement, which it always was, but he's opposed to EU enlargement. And the EU in 2010 had begun this Eastern Partnership, which was applied to post-Soviet states like Ukraine, encouraging them. It offered them integration, but not membership into the EU. The Ukraine here became and was always seen as the key element in the Russian world. It's the missing link, because Belarus is in Putin's pocket, in Russia's pocket, but Ukraine's the country that needs to be drawn back in, and that was seen through Russian pressure on Viktor Yanukovych, the then Ukrainian president, to ditch the Eastern Partnership, to ditch integration into Europe in favor of Putin's pet project, the alternative, Eurasian Economic Union. And that pressure led to the Euromaidan revolution, public protests against the ditching of European integration. We also, at this time, see, very important for today's context, the beginning of territorial demands against Ukraine. And again, these were largely ignored in the last 8 years. But Putin and other Russian leaders repeatedly talk about how the first Soviet leaders were wrong to include the south and east of Ukraine within the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and that these are so-called ancient Russian lands that should be returned. And this is, guess what? This is what they're doing in Ukraine today. I think the third and current phase begins with constitutional changes in 2020, where you move in Russia from this collective leadership to a dictatorship. So from collective autocracy to a dictatorship, single man dictatorship. And that again has the Soviet roots of that are that the Soviet Union developed collective leadership in the post-Stalin era because they were always afraid of a return to that Stalinist dictatorship, because many communists were murdered by Stalin as well. So in effect, he's gone back to that, away from the Brezhnev towards the Stalin dictatorship. The paranoia and conspiracies have grown as he's been isolated with COVID. Again, probably reading too many books. And what now we see is a link between domestic developments and external developments. In Russia, you have a move towards what I think many are calling a totalitarian state, some are calling fascist state, with the various examples of the letter Z, which is a kind of strange inverted sort of Nazi symbol. And that at home, that increased repression at home, where we see with, there's no tolerance for any opposition media at all, no tolerance for any opposition groups. Navalny they tried to poison him, and then that failed. They sent him to jail. That is linked to imperial expansion abroad. And so I think the two things are very, very, very closely interlinked. Putin's goals in the invasion are demilitarization, which should be understood as the removal of Western influence. The Ukraine has been portrayed in the Russian media and in political rhetoric for the last 15 years as a US puppet state. And secondly, denazification. This has nothing to do with fighting Nazis. Ukraine's led by, after all, a Jewish Ukrainian president. This is all to do with defining Nazis in the same way as the Soviet Union defined Nazis as any Ukrainian nationalist. So anybody who opposes the Soviet viewpoint or the current Russian viewpoint, if you don't believe you're a little Russian, you're a Nazi. Simple as that.
And of course, presumably that's also building on, for instance, the Great Patriotic War.
Yes. Putin has taken Russia. He's done the re-Sovietization. He's developed a cult of Stalin, and made the Great Patriotic War a religious cult. Now, doing that, he's taken Russia back to his Soviet childhood, because he grew up with the Great Patriotic War. What happened in 1964 was they could see that, Soviet leaders could see that there wasn't much enthusiasm for communism or for the anniversary on the 7th of November. So they created a new anniversary, 9th of May, Great Patriotic War, which became far more important actually in the Soviet Union than the Bolshevik Revolution on the 7th of November. And Putin's returned to that. He's returned to that. And with the cult of the Great Patriotic War, you have to have a cult of Stalin as the leader who defeated the Nazis, who built this East European empire, built a nuclear superpower. The West were afraid of us. But to do that, you've also got to downplay or deny Stalin's crimes. So I think the key final thing I'll say here is that what you have is two parallel developments in Ukraine and Russia, which are totally different. In Russia, you have the re-Sovietization of the country, Stalin cult, and the whole kind of development of this nostalgia for that era. In Ukraine, you have the exact opposite direction. Ukraine has been undergoing de-Sovietization and de-Stalinization since the late 1980s under Gorbachev. And that accelerated after 2014 with the passage of decommunization laws. And that led to dismantling of something like 6,000 monuments to Lenin in Ukraine. Ukraine is today one of the freest countries of the 27 post-communist countries with access to Soviet archives. And so all of that was a product of that. So you've had a kind of with decommunization, de-Sovietization, you get Europeanization. In Russia, you've got the entrenchment of that Soviet system. When I see the Russian army in action, to me, it's the Soviet army in 1945. There's no difference. When he pillaged and raped and looted through German territories and Polish territories in 1944-45. So you've got two completely different systems and approaches, and hence the clash in identities.
I'm gonna pick up on that because we've got a question from Jonathan Hearn. You suggested earlier that this is a confrontation not so much between nations as between civilizations. Could you define those civilizations a bit further? Should we be thinking of Huntington?
Well, no, because Huntington was completely wrong here. He defined it on the basis of religion. So if you look at Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, he divides Ukraine between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, and kind of lumps Ukraine's Orthodox East together with Russia. So actually, Huntington was partly right, but not. I think he was going in the right direction, but was actually wrong, because Ukrainian Orthodoxy, and one of the big things that really angered Putin was the Constantinople Patriarch gave Ukrainian Orthodoxy autocephaly, independence. It allowed the creation of an autocephalous church in early 2019. This had tremendous importance for the whole concept of the Russian world and Russian nationalism, because the Russian Orthodox Church always saw Ukraine as its canonical territory. Mm-hmm. And Ukraine contributed 40% of all the parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church. So with Ukraine becoming an autocephalous Orthodox country, that meant that the Russian Orthodox Church is no longer the biggest church in the world. It's now the Romanian. Russian Orthodox Church has slipped down. So the civilization concept to me is more a question of if in 2014, shall we say, let's go back then, you had a choice. In the war situation, the conflict, you can't sit on the fence. You have to, you can't say I'm Ukrainian and I like Russia anymore. You have to choose. Are you for Ukraine or are you for Russia here? Most 90% of Ukraine's Russian speakers, maybe more, stood on the side of Ukraine. They did that by backing a Ukrainian civic or civic ethnic identity, which they saw as part of Europe. So in that sense, it's a European civilization identity. They didn't see Ukraine as part of the Russian world or as part of Eurasia. If you, on the other hand, supported Russia's annexation of Crimea or supported Russian proxies in the Donbass, then you either had nostalgia for the Soviet Union, or you supported, the Russian world stroke Eurasia. And all of these things are interchangeable in the eyes of Russian nationalists. So there's no difference. So you're seeing, I think a good way of looking at this, by the way, is saying that you're either looking to the past with nostalgia, or you're looking to the future with Europe. And that would be a good way of defining it. I actually did a paper, I published an article, an academic article, comparing how these pro-Russian proxies in the Donbass were similar to Ulster loyalists. In that, the oldest and archaic form of British identity is to be found in Northern Ireland today. And, with the Orange Lodges and with these marches celebrating military victories in the 17th century, they're a bit embarrassing for many people in England. And in that sense, Ireland is similar to the Ukraine identity, which looks to the European Union as a vehicle to overcome the colonial past.
I'm going to pick up on something there. I mean, you say that, Huntington was wrong, but it does suggest that there is something there, and that you are looking at these civilization, not on the lines that he anticipated,
right?
But you do have those two large blocks there. We're running slightly tight on time, so if I may, I'm going to look forward to the future a little, and I'm going to do the awful thing of asking you to speculate on the future, which I know I'm never meant to do. One of the arguments, I mean, you make it specifically, but it comes through quite clearly in the book, it is that the war in Ukraine, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, is almost sort of foundational now for Russian nationalism, or that the Russian nationalist or imperialist view of itself requires it to have Ukraine. Now we may have a very protracted conflict now in Ukraine. It seems likely the what seemed like a rapid movement has stalled, and we've now got this very bloody conflict going on. If it continues like that, how does that affect how Russia would, the Russian self-image, certainly as it's sort of portrayed from the leadership of the country, might change? And the other thing is, how important to all of this is Putin? Let's say, I mean, there's always speculation about Putin's health, and I don't know how much we can, how much we can put on any of that, or how much weight we can put on any of that. But if Putin were to go, are there other people who who might conceivably become the next leader of Russia, who are coming from broadly the same view that you've articulated throughout, through your book, even if some of the fine details might be different?
Well, there are, again, good question, but there are probably a whole range, a whole spectrum of scenarios that could potentially happen with this war. I think a good way of looking at it, and I'm glad I didn't want to bring up the health issue, but I think it's a good way of looking at the Putin's health question, isn't so much to try and brainstorm what the hell he's got, because we don't know, of course,
Mm.
and it's all speculation. But to me, what the most important thing is that if he really does believe that his time is limited for whatever reason, then that could explain why he's done the invasion now. I mean, what is interesting is, and what I think as people like me are going to be investigating, is why the invasion now, not in 2014. Now, one reason is that Putin has evolved. He's become more of an extreme nationalist today than he was in 2014. The Russian far right, the Alexander Dugins and others in 2014, were calling upon Putin to do what he's doing now in 2014, and he didn't do it. In fact, in 2014, Dugin did something on YouTube where he said, kill, kill, kill Ukrainians. For that, he was expelled from Moscow University. Today, Putin is saying, kill, kill Ukrainians, repeating Dugin's phrase. So something has happened in those last 8 years that has moved Putin in that direction. I think that if he thinks that he's got limited time on Earth, then he needs to fulfill his historical legacy. He needs to do the invasion now, get Ukraine back to the Russian world before he leaves this earth. And that could explain the very chaotic and very badly organized invasion taking place. Now, the other reason as well is that the invasion was undertaken on the basis of these false Russian stereotypes of Ukraine as a country of little Russians suffering from a small group of nationalists who are very eager to be liberated. That's literally, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but that's how exactly they believe the country to be. So I think Putin's health probably did play a role here. And that combined with COVID isolation over 2 years, and then we have these ludicrous long tables, with politicians at one end and Putin at the other. Remember that Putin believes, and this again goes back to, I recommend people rereading Putin's speech in February 2007 to the Munich Security Conference, where he outlines 15 years ago that the West and Russia are at war. The West chose to ignore that. And it's like you got this sort of drunken bully on the street saying, come on then. And the West is going, no, we're not into that. So Putin believes that he's fighting the West in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a fake puppet state created by the US and the West. And once we defeat that, everything will fall back into normal. Ukraine will become a second Belarus. That's how they see it. Russian self-image has been battered by this, because the so-called second best army in the world has been shown to be a disaster and disgrace. I can't see Russia having great success in exporting arms after this war. Turkey, on the other hand, will be doing a roaring trade in Bayraktar drones. Now, the reason for this, the poor performance of the Russian army, is a reflection of what Putin's created in Russia. Of course, he's never going to admit that. And in a dictatorship, you only have sycophants surrounding the dictator. Nobody's going to go up to him and say, I think we've really screwed up here, or I think, this is a product of this. We need to change this. Nobody's going to tell him that. They're going to tell him what he wants to hear. Putin created the mafia state. In Western journalism, think tank work, and in WikiLeaks documents, going back 12 years ago, as far as 12 years ago, Russia was defined as a mafia state. That's even more the case today. Now, if you've created a mafia state, well, that inevitably is going to impact your military and your security forces. And it's not going to it's not going to exclude that. And I think one of going back to my points about Western so-called experts, remember that Western experts believed, like in Moscow, that Ukraine would fold within 2 days, that Zelensky would run, that Kiev would be captured, and this mighty Russian army would be all conquering. Western Russian experts believed the mythologies promoted by Russia of a Russian army that was reforming since 2008 after the Georgian War, and they completely ignored the whole question of corruption. To what degree this is corruption can be seen by photographs of Russian soldiers being given medical kits from 1978, and I'm not exaggerating. I have those photographs of out-of-date food rations, of massive pieces of Russian military equipment getting stuck in the mud because they've used cheap Chinese tires, which are too weak to hold up this military equipment. So thank God Russia is a mafia state, because that certainly has decapitated and made the Russian army not fare as well in Ukraine. Speculate. I think that the Western, and this week we have two summits, the G7 and NATO taking place. I think the Western leaders have reached, not without some difficulty, the conclusion that this will not end whilst Putin's in power. So we need to have, the goal has to be to defeat Vladimir Putin. I think Western leaders are wary of saying that they are in favor of regime change in Moscow. But if Putin is defeated in Ukraine, he's out. He cannot survive politically defeat in Ukraine. I mean, there's no honor amongst thieves in Moscow. And therefore, I actually believe the big battle isn't in the Donbass, where the fighting is taking place now in a big way. The big battle to come is going to be in the south of Ukraine, because Russia's goals are to deny Ukraine access to the Black Sea, and therefore to prove that Ukraine's a fake state, that it can't exist, economically without trade. And so I think the big battles are coming up there. Where Russia's at a disadvantage is that the Western military equipment coming to Ukraine is far superior to anything Russia has. And you even see that comparing Russian drones and Turkish drones. So I think there are only two choices really here. Some kind of stalemated, frozen conflict, or some Ukraine winning the war with the help of Western military equipment. The option of Ukraine surrendering or being defeated is simply not an option Ukrainians will accept. Why? Because that would be literally the end of Ukrainian identity. Russian media and Russian political discourse and Russian TV, I recommend taking a look at Russian TV. Sometimes there are clips on Twitter and elsewhere. They openly talk about eradicating Ukraine from the map of Europe. So if you have that kind of discourse, the option of surrendering or capitulating or doing some kind of deal is simply not on the cards. So hence, I think that the war will continue, but I think one of the scenarios could even be the Russian army just collapsing. It's in a dire state. There's a lot of discontent. There's desertions. There's people just trying to get out of it, not being sent there. So the Russian army depends on how much pressure is applied to it by Ukraine. But what this has done, this invasion, going back to your earlier question, is that it's galvanized this Ukrainian patriotism, which is now national. It's irrelevant what language you speak. You can speak Chinese. The International Legion fighting for Ukraine has people from 50 different countries in the world. And on my way back from Krakow, actually, I bumped into a British soldier who had been fighting there. I'm not sure if that completely answers it, but I think that the options are really for a quick end, maybe by the end of this year. I think that we should take into account as well the impact of Western sanctions, which various experts are talking about will begin to really bite from September, and how all of this plays together, as it were. And So I think people like me, unfortunately, are going to be very busy with this for quite a while yet.
Well, well, we look forward to reading your future publications. Taras, thank you very much. That's been absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate you coming on. As I say, Taras's book, Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War, is available now, published by Routledge. We've got more events coming up that we're slotting into the calendar, including one on looking at populism across Europe. That will be coming up soon. We're also going to be opening the call for papers for next year's ASEN conference on nationalism and multiculturalism that is being held at Loughborough University. Information on that will be on our website, asen.ac.uk, and also on our social media, of course. With that, all it leaves me to do is say thank you again to Taras
Thank
Kuzio.
you.
Thank you
Thank
all
you.
very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event soon. Have a
Thank
pleasant
you.
evening. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.